I'm reading this with permission from Scholastic, Chapter 4 of Some Kind of Courage. We trudged along for hours without neither of us saying a word. Once we'd passed the few buildings of Wenatchee proper, the rocky dirt road mostly wound through sage land and orchards and around boulders near as big as houses. The blue water of the Columbia River sparkled off to our left, and pine-dotted hills rose up on our right. Here and there we'd see a cabin or a lean-to where someone was trying to make a go of homesteading. A couple of folks passed us on horseback, and we had to get out of the way of one wagon, but for the most part we had that wide-open country to ourselves. It was warm for October, and I wiped at the sweat on my forehead from time to time. My companion insisted on staying a good 5 or 6 steps in back of me. The few times I stopped so he could catch up, he just stopped too and looked sideways at me until I got to moving again. Then the road took a sharp turn to the right, straight up into the layered hills that I knew would take us over Colocan Pass and to the town of Ellensburg on the other side. It sure looked like a lot of hills and a lot of climbing, but there was nothing to do but put our heads down and start on up. The road through Colocan Pass felt even steeper going up than I remember from coming down in the previous spring with my papa. Whether my silent partner liked it or not, we had to struggle a fair bit together, helping each other up and catching each other when we'd slip. He seemed a little less scared by my touch each time. We grunted our way up the mud track for who knows how many hours, and by the time the sun was near to setting, we still had hill after hill lined up in front of us. Looking back down the way we'd come, though, the river sure enough looked far off and small, so I knew we'd done some good traveling. The evening chill was already in the air, and dark was coming on quick. I reckoned it was time for making camp. At the top of a little rise, out on a point overlooking the whole great river valley, I spied a little dry, protected spot tucked nice and near under a big old rock overhang from the cliff above. There was a ring of stones on the ground and black soot on the rock ceiling, so I knew I weren't the first to find it. I led my nameless partner over and dropped my satchel in the beat-down dirt under the overhang. "This is it," I said. "Home sweet home." He looked at me with his unreadable face, still breathing hard from the last hill. "Let's get us some wood." I walked off into the underbrush and scattered small pines looking for good burning wood. My body was already starting to shiver, and I was eager as anything to get a good blaze going. Coming back into our camp, teetering under a load of wood, I noticed right off that the boy was gone. I dropped the wood and looked around, and there he came, stumbling out of the fading light with his own armload of wood. He dropped it with a clatter where I dropped mine. "Good," I panted with a nod. "More." By the time we had a big enough pile to last the night, stars were starting to blink above us, and the sky was that dark kind of purple just before black. Together we hoisted a nice big log with a flat side over to our camp and set it so we could sit on it. Then I pulled the matches I'd bought for Mr. Miller out of my satchel and set to getting a fire going. Soon there was crackling wood and cheerful yellow light and a more than welcome warmth from the crooked ring of stones. I found a seat on the log, and the Chinese boy sat on the other end, as far as he could from me without falling off. The overhang was a cozy little shelter, safe from most of the breezes that blew through from time to time, and the stone wall behind us bounced the heat of the fire back at us, so we was pretty much warm from both sides. We sat for a while, chewing at the apples and strips of jerky I took from my satchel. I don't know why I started talking. I guess maybe there's just something about sitting by a fire that makes a fellow want to talk. "I'm going to get my horse back," I said, staring into the twisting flames. The boy's head snapped up and he looked over at me sideways. "Her name's Sarah. She's a 9-year-old filly, a red and white paint with a notch in one ear. Prettiest pony you ever saw. Fast as blazes, too. She's half Indian pony, so she's got some spirit, but she ain't nothing but perfect with me. She turns 'fore I even have to tell her. Mama always said it was like we shared a heart, Sarah and me." The fire popped and hissed. Out somewhere in the darkness beyond the firelight, an owl hooted. The boy took another bite of his apple. Living with Mr. Grissom, I hadn't had a soul to talk to, and I could sure enough feel all those words crowding to get out of me. Pa got her for me when I was 4, when she was just a yearling, so we'd grow up knowing each other. Had me up on her right away. I was riding her bareback by the time I was 5 and jumping fences when I was 9. I looked over at him. I don't suppose you ever had a horse? He just swallowed nervously and kept his eyes on the fire. I got up to throw another log onto the fire. I stood for a second by the woodpile, looking up in the sky. Stars were glittering here and there, with more sparkling up all the time. My little sister said a funny thing about stars, I said, sitting back down. She'd heard that some Indians think the stars are the campfires of our ancestors, that once we die, we go up to join them and get a fire of our own. I knew my voice had gotten awful quiet, but since I was talking to a person who didn't speak a word of English, I figured speaking up wasn't all that important. When you die, you ain't got no matches or nothing with you, so she figures the fires must already all be lit by God, just waiting to welcome folks and give 'em a warm place in heaven to sit. She always wondered which one was for her. I felt a little smile, just a little one teasing at the corners of my mouth. But at the same time, I felt a hot wetness in my eyes. I tried to blink away. So we'd always look up and pick out ours. We'd pick out which one was our campfire, waiting for us in heaven. My voice broke off and I turned away, ashamed at the tears on my cheeks. But once those words started coming, it was like there was no stopping them. It's funny. Pa and I made it all the way down this pass with the mud and the switchbacks and the hairpin turns, dragging a log to slow us the whole way and fighting for every foot. And then the hill that kills him up over at Old Mission is plumb nothing. Just a little slope, really. Wouldn't hardly take your breath to walk up it. But the wagon just got a little away from us, and that wheel got stuck, and like that he throws me clear, and I'm rolling down the hill, and he's stuck under that cursed wagon. I sniffed and wiped up my nose. It ain't fair. Ain't fair for him to go like that after all we've gone through to get there. Ain't fair for him to go when I ain't got nothing or no one else left. Nothing but my horse. The tears were back and more than I could hold on to. I hid my face, but I couldn't keep my shoulders from shaking, and my breathing was loud and sniffling. I don't know what it was that got to me right then. Maybe it was just all of it. The cold and the hunger and the all-aloneness, and shot right through it was the feeling of my Sarah getting farther and farther away. I suppose sadness can sometimes be a storm that's easy to get lost in. I was surprised when I felt something touching my shoulder. I looked through blurry eyes and saw that the boy had slid on over till he was right up against me. His face had that same blank expression, but I thought I could see, mixed up in it, a little bit of something else. Understanding, maybe. He reached around just once and gave my back a little pat. Then he started talking. Quiet at first. So quiet I could barely hear him. That Chinese talking came on in a scratchy whisper, shy and stumbling as it got started. He talked into the fire, and the flames flickered in his eyes as his voice got more strength to it. His words were like a song I didn't know the tune of, full of quick turns and drops. I just sat there and listened, like he had for me. At some point, I realized he was crying, but only with his eyes. There weren't no shake to his voice, no sniffle to his breathing. His tears came down silent, like falling snow, and his talking never let up. I figured he must have had some words up in him, too. I sure enough didn't know a word of what he was telling me, but I reckon it had to do with the same kind of stuff stuck inside me. Family, and things that were lost, and having no place to call home. Maybe he was talking about his mama, however many thousands of miles away, or dead even. Maybe he was talking about his pa, buried back in Wenatchee, or about some brother or sister he'd likely never see again. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the little carving he'd shown me earlier, that shiny black stone bird. He held it out to me while he kept talking, and I took it careful, turned it over to look at it, and then handed it back to him. He slid it back into his pocket and wiped at his cheeks with his sleeve. I reached around him just like he had to me and patted him on the back. He looked at me with a serious face, then reached out and put his hand to my chest. "Joseph," he said. "What do you say?" "Joseph," he said solemnly with a little nod. Then he grabbed my hand and pulled it up to his own chest. I could feel his heart beating just like before, but weren't beating scared like a rabbit's anymore. Aki, he said, thumping my hand soft against himself. Aki. Aki, I repeated. He nodded, and I nodded back, and then I smiled. I pulled my hand from his chest, but left it out in front of him. He looked at it, and then understood and took it up in his own. We shook hands, sitting there shivering shoulder to shoulder on the mountainside with the campfires of our ancestors shining down on us. Pleased to meet you, Aki, I said.